In this movie, I'm going to talk about an e-learning design challenge that I run into every day, and that's working with text, solving some design issues with text. So I'm going to start here. I've got a little storyline movie that I prepared to demonstrate with. And the first thing I want to talk about is working with hierarchy and how certain things you want to grab attention before others, headlines, things like that. So starting by talking about using color for that. If you see these three examples, the red, the green, and the blue, my eye is drawn first to the red and then to the green, and then this blue one, it catches my attention, but it's not as distracting. So most companies don't like to use red. That's been my experience, unless it's a brand, a part of their brand, or unless it's a deeper, bolder red. This one is just kind of annoying because it's just so bright. So keep in mind that you can make things eye-catching without them being annoying. This dark blue, for example, would look great with a block of text underneath it, either in the text being dark gray or a dark blue. That way your eye is drawn to the headline, but you're still able to concentrate by looking at the page. It would be much more difficult to concentrate if the headline was in red, for example. Another idea for organizing things would be working with size. So this would be very familiar if you had done graphic design or worked with a newspaper, or just the basics of working with a hierarchy when it comes to text. The headlines are always the largest and then followed by subheads and body copy. Photo captions are usually smaller. It's okay to break some of these rules in certain situations, but keep in mind you want it to be readable. You want people to read the headline first and then the subhead. So anything that causes that order to be changed is not going to be readable. And then another idea is how you position things as far as being left to right or top to bottom. That also increases readability. If you have items that you're putting across the page, make them near each other or organized in some way. Maybe put a box of color behind it so that it's obvious they go together. In this particular case, I put arrows in here, but you could do that, but you don't have to. You could organize things so that people can tell that they go together. So just keep that in mind when you're laying out your text. Here's another challenge I run into when you have a lot of text to place on the screen. You really don't have room for a lot of graphics and you really need to break it up somehow. This is an example that I use a lot, just using a colored box with text in it, or it could just be a plain colored box, just something to break up between paragraphs or between sections. You can see here that I ran it all the way to the edge of the page, but I bring my text in a bit. You could also start the box in on the page. I just like them going to the edge. I think that looks nice. So that's a way that you can organize things. You could also put a thin rule between paragraphs or between sections, and that way you can scoot things up and use a lot less space by doing it that way. But nice ways to be able to just break up the text, make it a little bit more readable than just an entire slide of text. Here's another example down here where I just made the box shorter and I put a block of text next to it. I think that looks really nice, and I wouldn't do that in every instance, but it breaks it up every once in a while and just makes it easier. It's a little bit more interesting to look at. Here's another example of how you can break things up. These are both examples of just shaded boxes. This is something that I use a lot, and I try to put graphics in whenever possible. So this top example has a graphic with a photo caption underneath it and just a little bit of text next to it. The bottom has three graphics and three short phrases, maybe talking about the model number of that type of camera or something like that. And instead of putting it in as a bulleted list, this is far more interesting to look at. Here's another thought on working with text is to always keep in mind contrast. So the contrast is the grayscale value that is what I'm thinking about. So just because you're making things high contrast doesn't mean it needs to be a lot of color or gaudy. It's referring to the grayscale value. So if you look at these three, these are all very unreadable. The top one is just too dark of a gray against a dark gray background. The red is very difficult to read on a dark background. Red is just not good for text, period. This green might be okay if it was on a different colored background, but here against the dark gray, it's very difficult to read. This is that yellow that I mentioned in a lot of my movies that I really like. It's a more muted shade of yellow than that neon yellow, and that shows up very nicely against the background. Down here, I'm also talking a little bit about text size. Be very cautious of making your text any larger than 20 point is a good rule of thumb. You can see that large all caps text is just plain annoying. So avoid all caps unless you absolutely have to use it. I use it in instances if I'm telling someone to hit a certain key. If I'm telling them to hit the next button, I might make next in all caps. But making things all caps can be really annoying, so use that very sparingly. And here's my last section for this movie, and it's talking about when you have lists of text. Instead of the typical bulleted list, which everyone is familiar with and most people can't stand, you could mix it up a little bit. So instead of just having all the bullets appear on the screen at once, yes, you can transition them, but you could also do something like this where I replace the bullets with a graphic. Something simple like that that just makes it much more interesting. Here's some other ideas. Here I created my own squares because I couldn't get things to line up exactly, and I'm kind of a control freak. So I just made that lovely yellow that I like. I made squares and I made them large enough so that they sit next to the text and they really have some punch to them. But again, it's not super distracting, but it's a little bit more interesting than just looking at bulleted text. Down here, I just took what would be bulleted items and put them in shaded boxes. And because the background colors are all very similar in value, they don't compete with each other. And I think this looks really nice. It's very eye-catching, but again, the colors are very soothing. It's not annoying at all. And finally, this one talks about some other things that you can do when you have list items. Instead of just putting things on the screen as a list, you can create graphics out of it. So here, for example, I just created a simple graphic, and the user will click on each one of these and it will come up with a caption telling them about what the correct response would have been. It's much more interesting than just reading it in a paragraph. And down here is another similar example where I'm giving someone three separate options, but they can click on each one of them and it brings up a caption box. There's that yellow again, Sally. And it's much easier and much cleaner to display it this way, and it's more interesting for your user to be interacting with your slides as well. So those are just some of the examples of things that I run into when I'm working with text in e-learning.